Thank you, Rachel, and thank you all for being here. We come together today because of our collective outrage at a practice that has been going on for years and which must stop now. We're here today to denounce the practice of using rape and sexual assault survivors' DNA without their consent, of storing their DNA indefinitely, and using it for purposes totally unrelated to the prosecution of their abusers. We're here today to stand up for survivors of sexual assault, for their constitutional rights, for their dignity, for their right to privacy, and to encourage survivors of sexual assault to continue to have the courage to come forward, to cooperate with law enforcement, and to know that when they do that, we will have their back, we will honor their rights, we will prosecute their abusers, and we will not abuse their trust. The sanctity and the privacy of DNA that sexual assault survivors provide to law enforcement for the purpose of prosecuting their abusers must be limited to that purpose, and we want to eliminate all barriers to sexual assault survivors coming forward, cooperating, and working with law enforcement to make our communities safer. These are some of the most serious crimes that we see. They're also some of the most underreported crimes. They're also some of the crimes that are historically the hardest to prosecute precisely because of the kind of barriers that we're here to talk about today. And we know that historically in San Francisco and across the state of California, thousands of rape kits have gone untested altogether. And now we learn that those kits that were tested had the DNA not of the suspect or the perpetrator, but of the victim, of the woman or the person who came forward to courageously cooperate with law enforcement, to submit their body to an invasive procedure in one of their most vulnerable moments. And that trust has been abused, not just by the San Francisco Police Department Crime Lab, but we have reason to believe by crime labs all across the state of California, in a practice that has been described as routine. We're here today both to raise awareness about this problem, to ensure that it stops immediately, to stand in solidarity with leaders in the field of protecting and advocating for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, and to talk about solutions, not just at the local level. I'm proud to have Supervisor Ronan, who you'll hear from in a moment, who has already announced her plans to introduce local legislation to prohibit this horrific practice. Also, we're already in partnership with Senator Scott Wiener at the state level, and you'll hear from one of his aides in a moment about the work that we plan to do to ensure this problem ends today, not just in San Francisco, but across the state of California. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about what happens, about why it's problematic, about how we learned of it, and about the scale of the problem. But before I do that, I want to give other speakers here a chance to share their views and their words. Let me start with Supervisor Hillary Ronan, District 9 Supervisor and a long-standing champion for the rights of women and survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. Supervisor Ronan.
Thank you so much. Thank you, District Attorney Chesa, for bringing this shocking discovery to my attention. About 4 years ago, when I first became a member of the Board of Supervisors, a group of rape survivors came to talk to me and told me their stories of having awful experiences coming forward, reporting the rape, and getting a fair investigation of that rape, a fair prosecution of their attacker, and even having problems with the medical examiner's office and the general hospital where they got the rape kit. I held a hearing about the efforts in which women told their stories about how difficult it is to come forward after your rape. Remember, you are just violated in the most brutal and intimate ways. And if you decide to come forward and report that crime, you have to go to a hospital and have an invasive medical examination at the worst moment of your life, when all you want to do is take a shower and get any presence of your attacker off your body. But instead, you have to preserve the evidence, you have to go to the hospital, you have to get a rape kit. Then you have to be investigated by the police, and you have to potentially stand trial and tell your story to the public. It is so burdensome to report rape. It is so hard that it doesn't happen very often. If survivors knew that their own DNA evidence would potentially be stored and used against them at a future date, even less survivors would come forward. We, in the Board of Supervisors, created the Office of SHARP, and you're going to hear from its director, Kelly Lundensmore, in a moment, in order to make it easier for victims to come forward, have a champion by their side, and report rape. We know that 1 of every 2 women are sexually assaulted in their lifetime. These shocking statistics have to end. And the first way that we end them is by making it as easy as possible for survivors to come forward, as safe as possible, and to make sure that their intimate data is kept secret and only used for the purpose of investigating their rape. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Supervisor Ronan. As I said, we're honored to be working in partnership with Supervisor Ronan on local ordinances that would remedy this problem in San Francisco. Next, you're going to hear from Katie Stewart, who is the comms director for State Senator Scott Wiener. State Senator Wiener could not be here today, but we're already in dialogue with his office about a fix at the state legislative level that hopefully could solve this problem beyond San Francisco, but for all of California. Katie?
Thank you. I'm Katie Stewart, Communications Director for Senator Scott Wiener. He is not available today, so I'm going to read the following statement on his behalf. I want to thank District Attorney Boudin for elevating this incredibly important issue. Misuse of rape kit DNA is never okay. If this misuse is not currently illegal, and we're looking into its legality as we speak, then we must make it illegal, and I'm committed to advancing legislation to do so. We need to do everything in our power to ensure sexual assault survivors can come forward and feel safe and supported. Signaling to survivors that their rape kit DNA will be used against them is not how we make survivors feel safe and supported. Just the opposite. It tells them in no uncertain terms that they should not come forward. Sexual assault is one of the most traumatizing events imaginable. This kind of a misuse of a survivor's rape kit DNA is nothing short of unacceptable and re-traumatizing. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Next, you're going to hear from Pamela Tate, the Executive Director of Black Women Revolt, one of the San Francisco-based community groups on the front lines of supporting those who've been harmed by domestic violence and sexual assault, one of the groups that is doing really inspiring work in our communities to empower and to heal and to support those who've been harmed by domestic violence and sexual assault. Pamela?
Thank you. I have a pre-prepared statement on behalf of myself as co-executive director, as well as our founders, Jafria Morris and Lentice Jones. So I am Pamela Tate. I am the co-executive director of Black Women Revolt Against Domestic Violence. And I don't know why I have sounds coming out here. Sorry about that.
And you know what the word says.
And we're going to get rid of that. So I am the executive director, as I said, of Black Women Revolt Against Domestic Violence. I'm here today because this is absolutely ridiculous. As a survivor of sexual assault, I did not submit to a SART exam because it is traumatizing. You are in shock. You have so many other things that you are thinking about. And to think that if someone actually submits to such a intrusive, invasive exam, It's traumatizing enough to do that once, but then to have that be in a database, to be later used against you and re-victimize you by charging you with a crime as a result of data that no one should have access to unless they are actually trying to get the person who has raped and harmed someone is absolutely absurd. If this is a standard practice, this is a practice that needs to stop immediately. By signing a waiver, or which is a somewhat waiver, when you get a SART exam, there is nothing that alludes to the fact that you have signed away all of your rights for people to know all about what has occurred in your life. It does not give you the right to go 6 years later and to say, hey, we're going to look for this person in a whole nother database to see if it's related to a crime. It is re-victimizing the victim. It is unacceptable. We need to address this. We need to work on policies to eliminate this immediately. It creates barriers that, again, will harm people, that will make people not come in to get the assistance that they need. It will allow rapists to stay on the street because people will continue to underreport when they have experienced rape. It will increase crime here in San Francisco and throughout the state. We need to address this immediately. It is outrageous. We're tired. It is particularly targeting marginalized people, Black women, women of color, white women, men who are also assaulted and raped. No one has given permission for their lives to be examined and put in a database for anyone at any time to come and say that you are now going to be evaluated for criminal activity. 6 years ago, this person might have been on a perfect track. After rape and after you are working as a survivor, lots of things can occur. We don't know how she got from rape to this crime, but we do know it is unacceptable for people to be digging in a crime database for something that had nothing to do with why she gave that data. Again, this is Pam. I'm from Black Women Revolt, and we stand firmly that we want this policy to end immediately. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pam. We're next going to hear from Kelly Lou Densmore, who is the director of SHARP. As you heard Supervisor Ronan talk about, SHARP is a relatively new addition to the city family of agencies. We all wish we lived in a world where it weren't necessary to have an organization like SHARP, but we're so thankful that we do, and for the work that Kelly Lou and her team do every single day to help raise awareness, to help fight to prevent, and to help ensure there's accountability when sexual assault does occur. Kelly Lou.
Good morning. My name is Kelly Lou Densmore, and I'm the director of SHARP, the Office of Sexual Harassment and Assault Response and Prevention at the Human Rights Commission. SHARP was created by survivors for survivors, as described by Hillary Ronan with her outstanding support of this office. The office works to ensure that survivors are believed, responded to, and treated with dignity by city government when voicing their experiences of sexual violence. We advocate for survivors when navigating the city's current response systems, and we work with community to transform and create new system approaches to addressing and ending sexual violence. Today, I am here in support of the DA's decision to drop the charges in this case. As we heard, DNA from a rape kit should never be used to arrest someone in an unrelated matter. It's appalling that this is current practice. The majority of survivors never report an assault. This is especially true for survivors who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, disabled, transgender, and part of the LGBT community, as well as other marginalized groups who already do not trust law enforcement and city agencies. This case shows us how deeply flawed our criminal justice system is when addressing the needs of survivors of sexual violence. We need survivors to feel comfortable and safe when accessing services. Getting a rape kit is an extremely vulnerable experience and often re-traumatizing, as described by previous speakers. Survivors need absolute support and encouragement when getting a rape kit done, not the fear of future criminalization. Survivors need systems that center their healing after violence. The Office of SHARP was created for moments exactly like this. We advocate for survivors of sexual assault who have attempted to use city services such as getting a SART or a rape kit, who have attempted after experiencing violence and have faced barriers and challenges. We work with survivors to change the policies so that the policies center their needs. If you or someone you know have experienced a sexual assault or have faced challenges and barriers with a San Francisco city agency, you can file a complaint with our office. Our complaint information is on our website. It's sharp-sf.org. Again, SHARP supports DA Boudin in dropping the charges in this case, and we applaud the legislation and other changes that are being made so that this never, ever happens again when someone takes the vulnerable risk of getting a rape kit. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly Lou, and I just want to reiterate what an honor it is for me to stand here today with so many leaders in this work who have the courage to take a stand in support of an issue that is at the heart of public safety in this city. There's nothing more important to me than making San Francisco safe for everyone, and that includes especially vulnerable victims, people of color, women, marginalized groups, those that are more often than not targeted for sexual assault and rape. We have a lot of work to do, and every single time that someone is sexually assaulted, my job and my commitment is to hold the person that did it accountable. I'm proud that under my leadership, charging rates for sexual assault have increased. But every one of those cases requires a survivor to come forward, to have the courage, the persistence to go through what Supervisor Ronan described. And it requires trust. That's why we're here to talk about how we're going to move forward and how we're going to rebuild trust between law enforcement and vulnerable victims of sexual assault. And we have a simple message for anyone who has ever experienced sexual assault. The San Francisco District Attorney's Office, all of us here today, stand with you and for you. And you have our word that we will fight for you, and we will respect your dignity and your privacy and your courage and your integrity. And we will not abuse that trust. I want to describe for a moment the problem that we're all here discussing. And I'm going to do it in detail. So for those of you watching live, I want you to be prepared. We're talking about difficult issues. After a sexual assault or a rape occurs, as Supervisor Ronan and others have described to you, victims want, in many cases, nothing more than to go to a safe space, to shower, to clean themselves. It takes courage. It takes persistence to go to a hospital instead, to preserve evidence that can be used by my office to hold the person that harmed you accountable. And the gathering of that evidence is an invasive process. You heard Pam describe reasons why she and so many others choose not to go through that process after surviving the unthinkable. Who wants to have a group of people looking at your body, taking your clothes off, putting your legs in stirrups, poking and prodding your most intimate parts? And when those survivors that come forward and submit their bodies to that kind of a process do so, they're traumatized. They've just experienced the unthinkable. And they're given a long form. I've got a couple pages of it here. They're given a long form. It's a forensic medical report. It's Cal OES 2-923. And on that form, on page 2 of that form, there's a patient consent section. And it's fine print. You can see how little it is. It's not designed to be easily read or understood by someone who's just been traumatized. But there is no mention anywhere, even in this fine print, that DNA submitted in this process can be used for purposes unrelated to the investigation and prosecution of sexual assault. There's no reference anywhere, even in this fine print, to the idea that your DNA could be stored in a law enforcement database indefinitely. And yet that's exactly what's been happening. And we know that it's been happening in San Francisco since at least 2016, if not earlier. We don't know how many thousands of survivors of sexual assault have their DNA without their consent in violation of Marcy's law, in violation of the Fourth Amendment, stored in this database. We don't know if there are children who have survived sexual assault who have their DNA in this database. We don't know because the process has been opaque and it has been hidden from public view, and it must stop today. What we do know is that the SFPD crime lab and likely other crime labs around the state have, as a matter of routine practice and policy, been storing DNA from every sexual assault or rape kit that gets gathered in a database. And we know that as a matter of routine practice, they have been testing DNA from future unrelated crime scenes against that database. How do we know that? Well, I'm looking at a report of laboratory examination, forensic biology examination from the San Francisco Police Department Crime Lab. And in it, it indicates that there were two items compared. One was the unknown DNA left by a suspect in a crime that occurred recently. And what it says is, during a routine search of the SFPD crime lab, and it goes on and says that it compared that unknown sample with a known sample submitted back in 2016 in a rape kit. In a rape kit where a survivor had the courage and the fortitude and the trust to come forward and submit herself to an invasive process so that we could do right by her. Well, it is my commitment going forward to never use DNA obtained in this unlawful way. It is my commitment to work with Supervisor Ronan, with State Senator Weiner, and with all other leaders of good conscience in the community and in the legislature to ensure that this practice ends and that sexual assault survivors can trust in law enforcement and have confidence that we will not abuse their trust, that we will stand with them, that we will fight to make San Francisco safe for all of its residents. Thank you. Happy to take questions, as are other speakers.
So this question is regarding the case your office announced yesterday, the woman arrested for felony property. Chief Dodd said he's since been informed that the individual, there was a DNA hit for that individual from the non-victim database. Are you aware of that?
I want to be really clear about a couple things. One of the reasons that we're all standing here today is because of a commitment to privacy for survivors of sexual assault. And because of that, I am not going to get into the details of one specific case. We are here to end a routine practice that violates the law and abuses the trust of survivors. What I can tell you about this specific case is that I just read to you from the lab report in this case. And it says, during a routine search of the SFPD Crime Lab Forensic Biology Unit internal quality database, a match was detected and verified. Direct comparisons with the sample listed below were performed, and it references a 2016 sample from a rape kit. That's what happened. This is a report from the SFPD Crime Lab.
Just to follow up, though, when were you first made aware of this particular case?
A couple days ago, just at the end of last week.
But if this problem has been going on since 2016, why are you now talking about it for the first time?
Because I was just made aware of it for the first time late last week.
So do you have any other evidence besides that piece of paper that this is actually a practice that's pretty routine? Because what you just said is basically putting a whole lot of doubt into all kinds of other cases that are currently potentially in progress or have already been closed since 2016. Are you resting this entire argument on that one piece of paper?
I'm not. We've had extensive conversations with staff, including leadership at the SFPD Crime Lab. We were told this is a routine practice.
It is also interesting, we were just here just a week ago, and I'm kind of curious, there's been a concern that the police department has been concerned about your working with them. Why have a news conference announcing this now and not try to figure out some way to work on policies rather than doing this right now in public?
We need all survivors of sexual assault to know immediately that we have their back, that they can trust in this process, that we will not stand by and watch while their trust or their DNA is abused and used for unlawful purposes.
Do you
We're gonna
have
take
enough
questions
evidence
from other
otherwise
folks.
to be able to charge this person? Or like she mentioned, are you dropping the charges against this person who's charged, as we presume, under felony robbery?
No, there's no robbery charge here.
Or
Next
what are
question.
the charges?
We're going to take questions over here. Kristen?
I'm wondering if you're going to be going through older cases and possibly overturning, seeking to have verdicts overturned. Where do we go next? How deep can this go in terms of looking backwards to cases at least to 2016?
We hope and expect that SFPD will fully cooperate in revealing the full scope of this problem. We don't know how many thousands of cases may be implicated. My hope is that there are not many cases that are implicated. My hope is that there are only a few cases that have actually been prosecuted as a result of this DNA. What we do know is that the database that exists is searched on a daily basis in ways that violate Marcy's law and that violate the Fourth Amendment. Whether or not those searches result in a case being filed, and whether or not, to the last question, the sole basis for us to proceed in that case is this unlawful DNA search is a different question. We need to look case by case, and I fully expect full cooperation from SFPD.
We have a question right here. You talked about this happening statewide. Can you talk more about that?
Sure, sorry to interrupt, go ahead.
Yeah, just, you mentioned that it happens all over California, so it's not just San Francisco.
Our conversations with leadership at the SFPD Crime Lab suggest that this is a routine practice not only in San Francisco, but at other crime labs across the state. In other words, what we understand is that crime labs that collect and process DNA from survivors of sexual assault do not limit the use of that DNA to the sexual assault case. Instead, they build a database with it. And that's, as we're told, not specific to San Francisco. It's done all across the state. It's highly problematic wherever it happens, whether it's in San Diego or Sacramento, for the same reasons it's problematic here. I want to be clear, there's a lot of different DNA databases, and this can get very technical. Some DNA databases, like CODIS, are national databases. We don't have any reason to believe that survivors of sexual assault in San Francisco are having their DNA input into CODIS. They're being maintained, as this lab report says, in an SFPD internal quality database. It's a database limited to San Francisco, but used routinely to search unknown DNA samples against. Other crime labs have the same practice.
Is it legal to do this?
We have very grave concerns about the legality of this practice, particularly under Marcy's law, which is the California Crime Victims Bill of Rights. It's Article 1, Section 28, subparagraph B of the California Constitution. And one of the rights that are specifically laid out in that part of the California Constitution for victims are the right to have their property returned to them, to be fully informed of what's happening with their property, and to have it used only for the purpose that they've agreed to have it used for. And here, biological material, DNA evidence that belongs to sexual assault survivors, that's gathered from them in the most invasive manner any of us can even think of, is being stored and used and not returned or destroyed in a database that we know goes back at least to 2016, if not longer. Supervisor Ronan?
Yes. I have currently asked the city attorney's office to draft legislation making this practice explicitly illegal in San Francisco. So hopefully in a few short months there won't be any question about its legality, because it will be explicitly illegal in San Francisco if this legislation passes.
And when did you make that request?
I made this request yesterday morning when I found out about this.
To the city attorney?
That's right.
You have a question about?
Yeah, Boudin, if you suspect that this is a statewide problem, have you conferred with other district attorneys throughout the state to find out if they're getting similar reports or if they have similar incidences that they're aware of?
We haven't had an opportunity to do that yet. I look forward to speaking with my counterparts. As I said, we spoke with the staff at the SFPD Crime Lab. They said that this is normal practice. I do plan to bring this to the attention of the California District Attorneys Association, of the Prosecutors Alliance of California, and my counterparts in other states as well. This may be something that requires federal legislation.
And it sounds like you're aware of this charging, it sounds like you're aware of this charging incident. Are you aware of any successful prosecutions because of the DNA that was obtained in this manner?
I'm not, and I want to be clear about how opaque this process is and why, back to one of the other questions, it just came to our attention so recently. We have every reason to believe, as we were told explicitly by the SFPD Crime Lab, that this has been happening for years. But most of the reports we get don't explicitly say we tested a victim's DNA from a rape kit. They don't say it that way. It's much less clear, it's much more opaque, and as I tried to read to you the language in this report, which is one page of many hundreds of pages of discovery in an individual case, sometimes thousands of pages, buried on one page is reference to this 2016 incident. Nowhere on this does it say that incident was a rape. Nowhere does it say that the victim's sexual assault kit is the basis for that DNA sample. It required a proactive assistant district attorney asking questions, looking at the details. It required getting pushback from a defense lawyer who said, wait a second, what's happening here? The litigation process in this case is what revealed this transgression. That doesn't always happen. Does not always happen. And in some cases, there's independent evidence totally separate and apart from the DNA that allows us to proceed. But I will not ever use DNA that is obtained in violation of the Fourth Amendment, that is used in violation of Marcy's Law to prosecute a case. We must send a loud and clear message that public safety is our priority, that we stand with victims, that they can come forward, they can have the courage, and they can have the confidence, and they can have the reassurance that we stand with them.
Two-part question, District Attorney. First, you were just calling for basically federal legislation, but I just want to understand, the hard evidence that you have is that single piece of paper.
No.
So you have, do you have a sort of database? Have you built other than that single paper that you displayed, do you have concrete evidence?
Yes.
That this is a systematic practice that has been used in prosecutions in San Francisco and across the state, and you think maybe across the country?
Yes.
And is
Yes.
that evidence you are willing to present because it seems like you talked to the crime lab.
Let me be very clear. For those of you who want to nitpick and focus on the details of this case, we will not compromise the privacy or the dignity of a survivor of sexual assault. Hold on. If you have questions about whether or not this is a systemic practice, I would encourage you to ask the San Francisco Police Department Crime Lab two simple questions. And the answer to both of them will be yes. First, do you routinely save in an internal database all DNA that sexual assault survivors provide you in rape kits? The answer is yes. Second question, do you regularly test unknown DNA samples from crime scenes against that database? And the answer is yes.
Well, now, a second question for you. Thank you, District Attorney. Your critics, obviously this is a practice that is reprehensible and should be addressed, but your critics say that you are deflecting from the mismanagement of your own office by pointing to the SFPD, to national Republicans who you allege are funding the recall against you.
Mr. Attorney, we're not here to talk about the recall
Okay,
right now.
fine,
We're here to talk about survivors, and we want to keep the focus on sexual assault survivors and the systemic problem that is compromising their privacy and their rights. So I want to keep the focus on that. That's why we're here today. Question over here.
Quick question, when a woman goes in for a rape kit, I'm assuming there's paperwork, there's things to be signed, et cetera. Does it say anywhere, even in the fine print, your DNA will be used in the future for any other case or any other purpose?
It does not, and I have that form here. It's Cal OES 2-923. I'm not going to read you all the fine print because it's so long. I mean, you can see it's this entire section of the form that you can imagine if you're someone who just suffered a horrific sexual assault and you're now in a hospital being undressed, having paperwork from the hospital presented to you, the idea that you're going to be able to carefully read and understand and knowingly waive rights is preposterous under these circumstances. But nevertheless, nothing in this consent makes any reference to the DNA being stored indefinitely or used for other purposes. I'm happy to provide this form. It's a public document. I would encourage you all to take a look at it. It's available from caloes.ca.gov, and it's on the first page of the document after the cover page. And it's very clear. There's no reference whatsoever to future use.
And I can make it available for folks who are looking for it as well. We're going to wrap up there. Thank you all so much for coming. And if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
I mean, I just have a quick question about the timeline here.
If you want to come up to me privately, we can talk where we're ending the
I mean, so 2 days ago, you came up with this piece of paper, and now you're accusing the entire system of it. I just kind of want to make sure that I got the timeline right.
I'm happy to talk to you privately in just a moment. We're wrapping up the press conference, and I can talk to you in a second. I think we've answered your question several times, though.
Also, did I hear you mention as well that you are still considering the prosecution
We're
of
trying to
this
talk
case
to some of the
existing?
folks who were just here for a moment, so we could just have a moment, and then I'm happy to talk